We're pleased to welcome now Sean Tindell, Commissioner of the Mississippi Department of Public Safety, and Keith Davis, Colonel of the Mississippi Law Enforcement Division. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. Appreciate you guys coming in today.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Gerard.
So, Commissioner, start with you. We wanted to have you in to talk about what has been a bit of a rash, I guess you could call it, of threats in our schools across the state of Mississippi. What's going on there, and what's the role for the Department of Public Safety whenever these threats are received?
Well, and look, obviously over the last 20 years, that's become, a bigger and bigger priority across the country and obviously in Mississippi. And the legislature has instituted several measures to help with that, part of which is involving the Mississippi Office of Homeland Security to help do school threat assessments. And we go out and we do that across the state. And also trying to coordinate efforts between local law enforcement departments, state law enforcement departments, and help improve our communication efforts so that when these things happen, we're all aware of them and can respond accordingly. And, we've had a lot of growth at the Department of Public Safety. Of course, everybody knows we added Capitol Police and the MDOT law enforcement came over. And with that, we kind of separated our Highway Patrol Division and our Patrol Division out to also include now the Mississippi Law Enforcement Division. And so we have two divisions at our department, and both of them are headed up by a colonel, the Highway Patrol side, and then Colonel Davis on the Mississippi Law Enforcement Division side. And the great thing about Colonel Davis here is, he was a local police chief at Moss Point, has experience dealing with school resource officers, dealing with schools in the city of Moss Point, and, with Capitol Police, Homeland Security, and those other divisions falling underneath his purview. We've made a really big effort to try to improve our response and coordination on these school safety initiatives. So he can tell you a little bit about some of the calls and number of calls that we've had coming in since Homeland Security plays a vital role in responding to those, and I'll let him speak to that.
Colonel?
Good morning, and thank you for having us, Gerard.
Yes, sir.
So far this year, we have had over 94 calls where our local partners have requested assistance in these threats to schools, whereas last year we only had 66 of those calls. The majority of this year's calls have come in the wake of the shooting in Georgia, unfortunately. So whenever our local partners, sheriff's departments or police department calls us, obviously the Office of Homeland Security takes an active approach in assisting them in those investigations. And we've made some arrests in some of those investigations. Obviously, I can't talk about them because a lot of them deals with juveniles. Mm-hmm. But the Office of Homeland Security is actively working with our local partners to try to identify these individuals as quickly as possible because, the protocols at these school districts is automatic lockdown when these calls come in. And that caused a disruption for learning, the learning environment. But we try to get a resolve as quickly as possible.
So 94, and we've only had school in session, month and a half or so? Unfortunately,
that's right. So we are definitely trending to see an increase in these threats coming into our schools.
I mean, what is it that's made these schools a magnet for this sort of stuff? Mass shootings seem to happen more in schools than they do anywhere else, and then a number of threats that perhaps turn out to be nothing or false, fake threats, just copycats or people looking for attention probably more than anything else. What is it about the schools?
We just left, the commissioner and I just left a mental health summit that we're talking about ways to respond, law enforcement and mental health and substance abuse. I do think that you can look at some of these incidences and quickly understand that a lot of this stuff sometimes is people dealing with depression and then there's some that just don't want to take a test, which is just unbelievable to cause that much disruption in the learning environment. But what I would say to parents is know what your kids are doing. Pay attention to their time on the internet and what they're actually doing on the internet.
Yeah.
Well, and I'll say this, again, a lot of them end up being phony calls, and it does. It shuts down the school system. It pulls law enforcement away from other needed things that they need to be doing, whether they're investigating other crimes or responding to other calls. And sometimes it's just kids being kids. I mean, I know when I was in school, every now and then you get the bomb threat, and that's been going on probably for generations. But, I think one of the things that is much different now and today is how serious law enforcement responds to those. And it is never situation where somebody just says, oh, that's just a joke or that's just some kids. It is a serious response and one in which pulls a lot of folks together and literally shuts down the schools. And so, to the extent we find individuals that are doing that there's going to be accountability that's had for them. So anybody that thinks it's funny, any young people, I know they're probably not listening because they're in school, but their parents need to know that there's going to be some accountability for that when it happens. And I'll say this, the other thing that's always interesting with these, and we've had public safety summits where we've talked about school shootings across the country and why that response has to be so quick and so thorough, is the average school shooting takes place in less than 3 minutes. People look back at Columbine and they think that went on for 3 hours. It went on for less than 3 or 4 minutes. And so these things happen fast, and the response has to be quick. And we also have to look a little bit different when we approach our response to a high school compared to an elementary school. Your typical school shooter at an elementary school is somebody coming from the outside that is pure evil, wanting to do harm to children. And that's been time and time again what we've looked at. In high schools, a lot of times you're going to see it's a student that is disgruntled, somebody that might have been bullied, somebody that might have mental health issues. So the threat is coming from somebody that is supposed to be there. And so how you prepare for that and respond to that is in two totally different manners. And Colonel Davis mentioned it. Parents play a vital role. And even in the Georgia case, the family members tried to notify the school and department to let them know, hey, we think there's an issue. Now, it was really quick in time, but that helped. And then also the equipment that they've had that we've put in some of the schools on the coast, and I know they've instituted where they can go on lockdown and the teachers have the ability to notify of the threat really quickly. Although lives were lost in Georgia, it probably saved a lot of lives.
Colonel, what about the school resource officers? I guess a couple of questions. What exactly is their role when it comes to these sorts of threats? And do all of our schools have a school resource officer?
Unfortunately, they do not. Last year, Commissioner Tindell did request some funding to put school resource officers in every school. So we're working towards trying to ensure that everybody at least have access to a school resource officer. But to answer your first question, what is their role? Their role is to provide security to that school. They should know what the threats are and have a good plan of how to respond to those threats. So the school resource officer is a vital piece to what we're talking about today with these threats as they come in.
And are these typically uniformed law enforcement officers?
Yes, they are uniformed law enforcement officers typically. The current law allows for a school to have a security officer, unarmed security officer, but as I travel the state, most schools are going more towards a armed law enforcement officer.
And look, and I'll just be honest, I think the best case scenario, and we see it in DeSoto County where the local law enforcement, the sheriff's office says we're going to put a school resource officer at every single school, and they're going to be one of our sheriff's deputies. Okay. And then that way those communications are tied in directly to that local law enforcement so that they can coordinate responses. They're on the same radio systems. And so we're going to make a push this year to make sure that our school resource officers, even the ones that have their own police department within their school, are coordinating with our state and local departments so that we can further that response and be better at our responses. And the other things that we're looking at doing, and the law was passed this year to require school resource officers and campus police to also get continuing education in law enforcement. So there was certain levels of exceptions that were out there for school resource officers that we're trying to close that gap on to make sure that every law enforcement officer in this state is receiving the same training and the same continuing training, and that we're working on the same platform so that we can respond accordingly. And I know that's a lot of nuance getting into what the school resource officers are doing, but it is so important that we have those, and we want to have them at every school. But you also got to understand, if it's an elementary school where there's never been much of a threat and it's a local school district that might not have the funds, how long are they going to keep an officer there that they might not feel like is needed? So, we need to find ways to fund it. We need to find ways to tie it into local law enforcement. A couple of years ago, we did the Guardian Act. We tried to get that set up. Unfortunately, I think most of the school districts ran into problems with their insurance carrier saying that they would not insure the school if a teacher was carrying a firearm. So we did not have the response we were hopeful for, and because of that. But I still think that's something we need to continue to explore, is training teachers how to respond in those situations.
If you guys can hang around through the break, we'll continue the discussion on the other side. You guys
Absolutely.
good? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. We got Commissioner Sean Tindell and Colonel Keith Davis with the Mississippi Department of Public Safety in the Element Wealth Studio. We're taking a break. We'll be right back. So on the break, Commissioner, we were just talking about the advent of just lots of technology that is designed to physically and electronically secure school environments, to keep parents abreast whenever there's an issue, and all that's good stuff, but it costs money. It takes time to implement, and some districts, frankly, don't have the funding to purchase this sort of technology. And it's not a total solution exclusively, but it does provide tools that the school administration and SROs can use.
Absolutely, and we have a number of grants that we can issue through the Office of Homeland Security to help with some of that. And we're continuing to go to the legislature and meet with Senator Parker and Lieutenant Governor's office, as well as Speaker White and his office, about different things that we think would be important to offer, particularly for these local school districts and the ones that might have trouble affording some of this technology. But I got to tell you, in our new headquarters at DPS, we're trying to create a real-time statewide crime center. One of the benefits of that technology is we would be able to live feed, if the schools would allow us, live feed all their internal cameras into our real-time crime center, so that if we did have an active shooter and we needed to respond, you would actually be able to see what was going on with the schools, and law enforcement would know exactly where they needed to go and how they needed to respond. And really, with cameras where they are now, they're so much cheaper than they used to be. It is something that if we can get that on board, and the school districts will install them, and we have the technology now that would allow us to across different platforms feed it all into one centralized crime center. We could help with those responses, because you know exactly what room the shooter's in, what hall he's going down, and that's critical. And then just also the panic situations where a teacher can hit that button and put the school on lockdown. And again, in Georgia, that certainly saved lives.
Yeah. And the artificial intelligence now, using the artificial intelligence that is embedded in video surveillance that perhaps could detect the presence of a perpetrator with a weapon on the perimeter.
Absolutely.
To see that before they start unloading.
AI is a game changer, and we're looking at different ways we can use it, not just in schools, but in our criminal investigations, particularly where we're trying to identify high threats areas and particular crimes that might occur based on data that we see. And then when you look at schools, and you can incorporate AI into maybe some of the communications that are going on in the school, maybe certain platforms that they have where they share information or emails, the AI might be able to pick up, hey, this child has a mental health issue, could be subject to depression, and maybe we need to get some help looking at that child.
And Colonel, to that point, you mentioned in the last segment that you believe that the mental health issues in our society are core to this problem. I tend to agree with you, sir. What should we be doing here in the state of Mississippi to address this issue?
Well, I'm glad you asked. Today, as we speak on this show, we are engaged in a summit with all of the mental health partners across the state, as well as local law enforcement. And, I said this morning that no individual in that room have the answers, but collectively, when we start talking, we can come up with some kind of solutions that we could push to the legislature for policy construction. So, we, at the direction of Commissioner Sean Tindell, we are actively looking at ways that we can do better from a law enforcement response to deal with mental health. We talked about also this morning the horrible situations of us not being educated in law enforcement on how to respond to mental health when there's an episode happening. So what we're working towards is trying to identify and deal with episodes before an actual critical episode happen. We want to deal with the person when they're just going down the road instead of being at the end of the road. So we're having those discussions right now.
I mean, you wonder, Colonel, if that being the case, how much of these acts could be deterred or totally avoided, while at the same time getting this person the help they need.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that's what's so critical is getting them the help that they need. And right now, HIPAA laws and there's so much bureaucracy and and it's not about trying to identify what person is dealing with. It's, hey, you need help, and whatever that help is, we need to get you to your proper facility to get the help.
Commissioner, how does that perhaps cause a problem for law enforcement, for your agency, in that you're maybe overstepping your bounds and invading a person's privacy? It's a fine line you're walking there.
Well, and it creates challenges, and the reality is we ask our law enforcement officers to be law enforcement officers. And moving into today's world, they also have to be mental health experts. They have to be marriage therapists. They also have to be constitutional scholars when they're out there dealing with folks. And so we put a lot on the back of a law enforcement officer, and that's why today with this summit that we're doing, we're calling on our partners from the Department of Mental Health, the Department of Health, those that have experts in those arenas, and try to figure out ways that we can work together so that the law enforcement officers can do their job. But the other mental health professionals can be called in to do their job as well, and we can work together and coordinate on that. And that's, again, one of the issues with school resource officers is trying to make sure that the superintendent, the principals, those that are at the school understand that these are law enforcement officers. They're not security guards. They're not there to uphold school policies. They're up there to be law enforcement officers at that school, because law enforcement officers have their job to do. And others need to be able to come in and step in and handle those mental health issues, particularly at a school, not to just be dealt with from the law enforcement officer standpoint.
And you've implemented recently, right, some initiatives within the Department of Public Safety. There's more focus on that, particularly from the perspective of the mental health of the law enforcement officer.
Absolutely. And look, there's a lot of stresses in everyday's life. There's stresses on our law enforcement officers. Major Johnny Polis has really helped lead the effort with our peer support program, where we reach out to each other and we try to offer that, especially after critical incidences. So, mental health is something that affects everybody in one way or the other. I was talking to the group today, and my dad was a Vietnam veteran who suffered tremendously from PTSD. He came back with all his fingers, all his toes, all his arms, and his legs, but he wasn't himself when he came home, and he needed help. And unfortunately for him, 20 years later, the diagnosis came too late because he had turned to alcohol. That's where in the schools we can make such a difference if we can identify these individuals that are having mental health crises and issues, get them the help they need so that they don't turn to using drugs, they don't turn to going down a bad path, and we can get them in a place where they can be productive citizens and find some fulfillment in life.
So, Colonel, as part of this program, or are we educating school teachers, administrators, and so forth that are around children and their parents to a great extent to be able to identify and detect these situations?
Well, we do plan to have those discussions. Today it's just about a brainstorming with the state, all of the state partners. We do have some local police departments. The Jackson Police Department chief is there. Thankful that he's there, as well as Hines County Sheriff's Office. But what we want to accomplish out of today's summit is some directions on how to go out and start having those conversations in the local school districts.
And is the legislature supportive of this,
Yes,
Commissioner?
Absolutely. I mean, anytime we get together with our partners and the speaker, the governor, the lieutenant governor, it's one of their top concerns is school safety. And so they've been supportive of any initiative, particularly when we get together with our partners at mental health, the Department of Public Safety, the Department of Health, the Department of Education. We all come in together and say we think this is a good idea. It really tends to take off. And so, yes, they're 100% supportive. And looking at things like we had the Guardian program for the teachers, that didn't come to fruition like we had hoped it would. But it might be an opportunity where we go back to the drawing board, and instead of teaching these teachers how to carry firearms, we work more with the Department of Education to do mental health training for teachers and other things that we can coordinate. And so, I'm a big believer of, we keep trying. Not all the ideas are going to work, but we're going to keep putting something out there until we get better solutions. And if you look at it historically in Mississippi, we have worked really hard to try to ensure school safety, and I think we do a really good job of trying to be on the forefront and working together to come up with ideas on how to keep our schools safe.
We'd like to never have an incident, of course, Colonel, in our schools or anywhere in this country, honestly, like that puts Americans' safety at risk. But in the wake of a situation like just occurred in Georgia, is there communications? Is there sort of a breakdown and some post-analysis that's done that's then distributed within the law enforcement community you guys can use to learn and maybe improve?
Exactly. Part of those communications is just like, coming on your show, and thank you for what you do. I want to talk about, of the 36 reported incidents, 22 of those have resulted in arrest in the last 6 weeks. So that deterrence, individuals need to know that, if you're thinking about, doing something foolish like this, you need to know that law enforcement is going to pay you a visit, and it's going to be swift and it's going to be harsh. So those communications are happening each and every day. Our office has reached out to Georgia, and we've been talking to Georgia Bureau of Investigation. So, yes, we are having those conversations among ourselves.
Gentlemen, appreciate you guys coming in, and always, as we always do, we want to thank the men and women of the Mississippi Highway Patrol, our state troopers, for keeping us safe and patrolling our roads. Thanks, guys, for what y'all do as well. Appreciate you coming in.
Thank you, Gerard.
Thank you, Gerard.
We're coming right back in the Element Wealth Studios. Stay